There is a moment every autumn in the county of Harlan that the old-timers still speak of, when the road to the Caldwell plot fills up bumper to fence post with wagons and later with motor cars, and the smell coming off that hillside is something between a bakery and a church, warm sugar and wood smoke, and something darker underneath, something almost like wine. People come from 3 townships over to wait. They bring their own jars just in case. They stand in the tall grass at the edge of the drive, and they hold their hats, and they wait, because Marin Caldwell's plum preserves are worth waiting for, and everyone in Harlan County knows it now, even the ones who laughed first. But in the July of 1896, 2 years before any of that, a young woman stood alone in the bed of a borrowed wagon outside Fisk's Mercantile and looked at a pile of plums and did not feel triumph or patience or destiny. She felt her pockets. She had $6 to her name, $6.41 to be exact, and she had already paid 2 months ahead on the land note with the rest. That is where the story truly starts. 3 years earlier, the summer Marin turned 19, she came to Harlan County with nothing but a leather satchel, her mother's copper-bottomed pot, and a handwritten deed to 40 acres on the western ridge above the Caldwell crossroads, a parcel that had belonged to her Uncle Delmar, who died without children and left it to the only niece who had ever bothered to write him letters. The town of Harlan had a settled opinion about those 40 acres, and that opinion was that they were worthless, not figuratively worthless, not undervalued by modest people who lacked imagination, worthless in the most specific and literal frontier sense. The soil on the upper 20 was clay hardpan the color of old brick, cracking in summer into a pattern that looked like the palm of a dry hand. There was a creek that ran down the eastern edge, but it fell low by August every year to barely a whisper over the rocks. The lower 20 had good bottomland timber, which Delmar had sold off in 1889, and the stumps still stood in rows, like the ruins of something that had once mattered. A previous owner before Delmar had planted an orchard on the south-facing slope, 60 trees, and half of them had given up and died, and the other half stood gnarled and gray, the kind of trees that looked like they survived out of pure stubbornness rather than any nourishment the ground was still willing to give. Those were the plum trees. Marin did not know they were plum trees when she first walked the property in late September of her arrival year. The week after, she had paid $13 for the deed recording fee and moved her few belongings into the cabin that stood at the north end of the lower 20. The cabin was sound in its bones. Delmar had at least kept the roof tight, but it was one room and a lean-to, and it smelled of mice and old boots. She chinked the wall gaps herself with clay and grass fiber she cut from the creek bottom. She split firewood until her hands went rough and cracked at the knuckles. She planted a late kitchen garden in the black soil near the creek and got enough turnips and dried beans to see herself through winter. Barely. When people in Harlan saw a young woman alone on that ridge, working that ground, they were not cruel, precisely. They were practical. The frontier does not produce many outright villains so much as it produces sensible people who apply common sense to other folks' misfortune. What Marin heard in the Mercantile and at the post office and at the twice-monthly town meeting where she sat in the back was this: a girl alone out there won't last. That ground won't yield. She'd do better to sell what she can to Aldous Prewitt and move to the boarding house in town. Take in sewing. It was not malice. It was the arithmetic of experience, delivered without much warmth but with what passed in that county for honest concern. Marin listened. Marin nodded. Marin went home and lit her lamp and did her own arithmetic, which came out different. The old man who validated her arithmetic was named Stefan Horak, who had come from Bohemia in 1861 and farmed the valley below her western fence line for 34 years, and who had the leathered patience of a man who had learned to read land the way other men read Scripture, slowly, with complete faith that meaning was there, even when it was not visible. He came up her drive one October morning with a tin of smoked sausage and looked at those gray plum trees for a long time, and then turned to Marin and said, in the particular accented English that always sounded to her like a song being sung in two languages at once, "These trees are not dead. A dead tree does not try. These trees are still trying. You see how the branch tips are still green at the tip?" She looked. They were, just barely. A thin edge of alive at the end of every gray limb. "They want water and to be cut back hard," he said. "The other two things, you cannot give them, the years of root and the good air off that slope. Those two things they already have. They only need to be asked properly." Marin asked them properly. That winter and all the following spring she pruned those trees back with a ferocity that made Stefan wince when he came to watch, cutting whole arms off, reducing some of the older trees to almost nothing but their main trunk and 3 good branches. She dug trenches along the root lines and filled them with composted manure she hauled by wheelbarrow from Stefan's barn in exchange for mending his fence line. She diverted a small braid of the creek with a channel she dug herself, 20 yards of it, with a mattock and a spade, so that a slow seep of water would reach the roots of the lower rows by midsummer. The trees bloomed in April of 1895, not magnificently, not abundantly. A hesitant, thin bloom, white flowers opening like small decisions. But they bloomed, and the plums that set that first year were small and tart and split their skins in the late August heat, so that a third of them fell from the tree already cracked open, weeping juice. Marin tasted one standing under the tree on a hot afternoon, and it hit the back of her mouth like a coal, sweet and dark and acidic all at once, nothing like the pale sugared preserves she had eaten from store-bought tins. She did not tell anyone what she thought about those plums. She banked it low, the way you bank a coal under ash to carry fire through the night. Which brings us back to July of 1896 and the pile of split plums outside Fisk's Mercantile. What had happened was this. A man named Devereux ran the stone fruit orchards in the Plum Fork Valley 12 miles east, and he was a large operation by county standards, 400 trees, a shed crew, a wagon that went every week to the railhead at Calder City. Devereux had had a spectacular August the year previous and had planted to double his harvest, and in the summer of 1896 his trees came in so heavy that the fruit began to split on the boughs in the first week of the heat wave. 250 pounds of damaged plums pulled and piled in his sorting yard, unsellable to the cannery in that condition, too juicy and cracked to ship, and already drawing bees. He would have plowed them under, except that word went around he would take $6 for the lot just to have them hauled away. Everyone in Harlan heard about those plums. Everyone agreed there was nothing to be done with them. Split fruit goes to mash in 3 days in summer heat. You could not make jam worth selling because the yield from split plums was all juice and no flesh. You could not dry them. Too wet, too split, they would mold before they dried. The general store already had a supplier for preserves. The sensible view, the practical view, the view of every experienced person in Harlan County was that 250 pounds of heat-split plums for $6 was not a bargain. It was just a different shape of nothing. Marin took the borrowed wagon to Plum Fork on the 3rd of July and spent her last $6. She hauled those plums back to the ridge in the morning dark, before the heat of the day could advance the softening, and she unloaded them herself into the cool of her root cellar, flat boxes stacked on the stone floor. Then she walked to Stefan Horrocks' farm, and they sat together on his porch in the early morning, and she told him what she had done. He was quiet for a time that would have felt uncomfortable from anyone else. "You have your mother's pot," he said finally. "I do. You have your own trees still coming. The 3rd week of August, I think. A good yield this year. Then you have a plan." She did. The plan was exacting, and she had worked it out over 3 months of winter evenings, and it went like this. Split plums, being already broken, gave up their juice willingly. That was their only sin. The flesh was still sound, still dark and deep-flavored. The key was to work fast and cool, to pit them the day they arrived, to macerate them immediately with sugar and the juice of the crab apples that grew wild along her creek, which provided natural pectin more reliably than any store-bought agent. She had sourced her sugar in 50-pound sacks bought on credit from Fisk's, a credit she had negotiated in March on the strength of nothing but a steady look and a handshake, because Walter Fisk was old enough to respect people who planned ahead. She had spent all of February and March collecting jars, every glass jar in Harlan that could be had for trade or a few cents, scoured and stored in her lean-to in neat rows that Stephen had helped her count. 211 jars of varying sizes. She needed every one. She worked for 11 days without stopping in any meaningful sense. She rose at 4 in the morning, before the heat, and pitched the operation to cook by 7, and processed batches until the late afternoon cool arrived, and then she cleaned and sealed and labeled and set them in the cellar in rows, and started over the next morning. The kitchen was oppressive, the copper pot steaming in July heat that was already vicious, and she was alone in it, except for 2 days in the second week, when a 14-year-old girl named Bertie Potts arrived on her doorstep saying she had heard there was work, and was that true? Bertie was the youngest of 7 children from a farm 2 miles down the valley, and she was sharp as a tack, and she could pit plums faster than seemed physically possible, and Marin paid her in jars, 3 jars of preserves per day worked, which was a wage Bertie considered generous, and Marin considered accurate. When her own trees came in the 3rd week of August, full and heavy from 3 years of patient tending, and the water from the diverted creek, the preserves changed. The purchased Devereux plums had given her volume and taught her the recipe. She had adjusted the sugar ratio twice and the crabapple proportion once, and arrived at something she knew was correct, the way you know a thing that is finally right, not because it is finished, but because it is true. Her own plums added depth. They were smaller and darker and more acidic, and when she cooked them together with the sweeter Devereux fruit, the result was a preserve that tasted like 2 notes played at once, the jam equivalent of a chord. She did not advertise. She did not take out a notice in the Harlan Courier, which came out on Thursdays. She did not set a table at the market square. What she did was bring 2 jars to Walter Fisk in payment toward her sugar credit and leave them without comment. She brought 1 jar to Stephen Horak and watched him open it and taste it, and he closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them and said, "Marin, this is a serious thing." She asked him what he meant, and he said, "I mean, this is not hobby house jam. This is a thing worth real money if you ask for it." She did not ask for it right away. She waited. The jar at Fisk's Mercantile sat on the counter. Walter had cracked it open on a Tuesday to spread on a biscuit for his own lunch, and the smell of it opened like a hand inside the store, and 3 customers asked what it was before noon. By Thursday, Walter had asked Marin if he could carry it. She said she would think about it. She was still doing arithmetic. Here is what the arithmetic looked like by the 1st of September. She had processed 212 jars of finished preserves. 1 jar she had kept back, 1 had broken in the cellar. Her cost was the $6 for the plums, the sugar credit at Fisk's, which she had tallied at $14.30, the jars which she had sourced at an average of 3 cents each for a total of $6.33, and Bertie Potts's wages in kind, which she valued honestly at $4.50 worth of preserves. Total cost, $31.13. She had 207 jars to sell. If she priced them at 30 cents a jar, she would clear $30.97 after cost. If she priced them at 50 cents, she would clear $72 and change. She had never in her adult life held $73. She priced them at 40 cents. This is the kind of decision that is hard to explain to a person who has only thought about money as a way of getting more money. 40 cents was fair. It was above the going price for commercial preserves by a dime, which her product had earned by being better, and it was below what the market, in its autumn hunger, might have stretched to pay. It left room for the people who needed it to get it. That was a thing Maren believed in the way Stefan believed in land, not as a policy, but as a fact about how a person ought to live. She had 40 jars to Fisk's on the 14th of September, and they were gone in 6 days. She sent 20 more, gone in 4 days. Word was moving through the county at the speed that word moves in a place where people see each other at church and at the mill and at the well, which is to say quickly. A woman from Calder City named Hendricks, who supplied provisions to 2 of the hotel dining rooms on the main street there, arrived at the Caldwell Ridge on a Wednesday afternoon in a smart black buggy and knocked on Maren's door. She tasted a sample Maren had waiting. She always kept a sample jar open, as if she had expected visitors, which Stefan said was the mark of a person who understood commerce better than most. And she put the spoon down and said, "I'll take everything you have left at 45 cents. Maren said, "I have 94 jars. Mrs. Hendricks said, "I'll take them all, and I want first option on next year's production." Maren sold her 80 of them at 45 cents and kept 14 back for Fisk's, for Stefan, for Bertie Potts, and for a purpose she had not yet disclosed. The sale to Mrs. Hendricks came to $36 even, 80 jars at 45 cents. She paid off the Fisk sugar credit the same afternoon, walked the 3 miles to town to do it, and put the remaining cash in the tin box under her floorboard, and lay awake that night, not from anxiety, but from something she had not felt in the county of Harlan until that moment, something that took her a while to name correctly. It was safety. A new feeling on that ridge. Now. There is a person in every story like this who has been watching the quiet progress of a thing and has decided that its success belongs to him, or at least that it ought to be transferred to him at the first opportunity, because he is the sort of man who mistakes observation for entitlement. In Harlan County in 1896, that man was Aldous Prewitt. Aldous Prewitt was a land broker and a sometime banker, a prosperous and careful man with a red face and good coats who had built his business on the Harlan area practice of waiting for struggling farms to come available and acquiring them at a price that he set. He had been the one 2 years earlier who had suggested through several intermediaries that Maren would do better to sell the Caldwell 40. He had valued it at $110. This was, even by the standards of bad land in a dry year, insultingly low. Maren had not responded to the intermediaries, which Prewitt had initially taken as ignorance, and later came to understand was something different. By October of 1896, Prewitt had a new interest in the Caldwell property. The plum trees were the thing, but not only the plum trees, it was the whole configuration of it. The hillside and the slope and the water channel she had dug, the way she had turned 40 acres of clay hardpan into a producing orchard by patient hands and careful thought. He could see it tripling in value. He had been watching Mrs. Hendricks's buggy come and go. He had heard about the waitlist because by the 3rd week of September there was, in fact, a waitlist, a piece of paper kept at Fisk's counter where people wrote their name and how many jars they wanted held from next year's run. There were 22 names on it by the 1st of October. Prewitt came to the ridge on a Tuesday morning, and he was courteous in the way that powerful men are courteous when they want something. He sat at her table, and he accepted the coffee she offered, and he said what he had come to say, which was that he would buy the Caldwell 40 for $500. Cash money, immediately available, no delay in the transaction. $500. Maren's hand on her coffee cup was still. It was a generous number for that land, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. It was just generous enough to seem like the end of a conversation rather than the opening of one. The message underneath the number was what she heard more clearly than the number itself, and the message was, "You are a girl alone on 40 acres, and even a good season does not change that. And the sensible thing, the practical thing, the thing anyone with experience would tell you to do is take this money before the luck runs." She looked at Prewitt for a moment without speaking, which was a thing she had gotten good at. "My trees are 8 years from peak production," she said. "The bottomland is coming back now that the stumps are rotting out. I had 40 jars waitlisted for next fall before the end of September this year. The year after that it will be 80, and the year after that I will need a second building." She put her coffee down. $500 is what this property is worth right now, in its condition. I'm not selling right now in its condition. I'm selling in 10 years when it is something else entirely, and that price will be something else entirely. Prewitt's courteous expression did not change. "You're a long way from 10 years, Miss Caldwell." "I know how far I am from 10 years, she said. "I counted it." He tried twice more over the next month, once through Walter Fisk, suggesting that the land note carried a risk of default if the next season disappointed, which was technically true but depended on a deliberately narrow reading of what she had earned and would earn. The land note was with the Harlan County Agricultural Trust and came due in annual installments of $40. She had made her payment in August and had the receipt. She had the next year's payment already in the tin box, set aside from the Mrs. Hendricks sale. He tried through a neighbor, Clement Rourke, suggesting that the orchard's productivity was probably a one-year fluke, clay hardpan land not being known for sustained stone fruit yields. Marin heard this through Stephan, who reported it with a faint sourness around his mouth that was his version of anger. The fluke theory did not survive November. Because what happened in November, what happened to the rest of Harlan County while Marin's 14 kept-back jars were still moving through the community, was a thing that the old-timers later called the dry account, though it was not technically a drought, but something almost more devastating for a farming economy. A catastrophic early frost on the 9th of November that killed the late apple harvest and the turnip crop, and split open every unprotected root vegetable in the ground within a 2-day radius of Harlan. The grain had come in lean that year already, the summer heat having shortened the wheat season by 3 weeks. And now the fall stores that most families in the county depended on to carry through to spring, the stored apples, the root cellars, heavy with turnips and parsnips, the late squash, were largely gone in 2 cold nights. Hunger settles a county down. It rearranges who is respected and how. The families who had bought Marin's preserves had something sweet and nutritious on their shelves in the deep of that winter, something with the late summer plums of the ridge sealed up inside a jar, something that could extend a thin meal or sweeten a child's corn mush on a black January morning. It was not survival, not strictly, but it was the difference between endurance and misery, and in a county that was intimately familiar with both, people understood the distance between the two. What had Aldous Prewitt prepared when the November frost came? He had a warehouse of late-season grain and root stores that he had purchased cheap from failing farms in September and October, which was his standard practice and one that the county had tolerated because it was legal and because Prewitt was prosperous, and prosperity in a small frontier town carries its own authority. He offered to sell those stores to Harlan families at what he called a fair winter price. What fair winter price meant was 4 times what he had paid in September. The county had no choice but to deal with him, and they dealt with him, and they came away from it poorer and sourly grateful in the way you are grateful to a man who has handed you a rope he was holding over your head. This is how the exposure came. The Harlan County Agricultural Trust held its annual accounting in the first week of February, a public meeting in the hall on Birch Street, where farm records were confirmed and land notes reviewed, a process largely procedural but attended by most property owners in the district. Marin went, as she always did, in her good coat, and she sat in the 4th row. Prewitt rose to speak, as he did every year, and he proposed, as he had proposed the previous 2 years without much opposition, an amendment to the land note terms that would allow the trust to call in notes early upon evidence of what he called sustained underperformance of the assessed parcel. It was a proposal that sounded like fiscal prudence and was in fact a mechanism that would give Prewitt's allies on the trust board the leverage to pressure struggling farms into early sale, and it had passed before, because no one understood the mechanism clearly enough to oppose it in plain language. This year it was different. Because Walter Fisk, who was on the trust board, had the waitlist paper from his counter in his coat pocket, and he read the names aloud, all 22 of them, when Prewitt finished speaking. And then he said quietly from his chair, "Aldous, how did you know Miss Caldwell's count? You said 80 jars next fall. She hasn't told a soul how much she'll produce." The room got very still in the way rooms get still when a thing is suddenly visible that had been hidden behind courtesy. Prewitt had spoken to her of next year's numbers in a private conversation on her ridge, numbers she had shared with no one except Stephen and Bertie. The only way he had them was if he had been somewhere he was not supposed to be, asking questions he was not supposed to ask, tallying a business he had no part in. Prewitt offered an explanation about regional market projections that nobody in the room believed, and the amendment was voted down by 11-3, which was the first time it had failed. Marin, for her part, said nothing in the meeting. Being right is its own kind of reply. After the meeting, outside on the boardwalk in the February cold, a thing happened that became part of the county's memory of that winter. A man named Orrin Galt, who ran the dairy on the Plum Fork Road and who had been one of the men who had spoken against her in her first year on the ridge, not with cruelty, just with the practiced dismissal of a man who believed experience was the same as wisdom, came to stand near her on the boardwalk. And he said, not quite looking at her, "I have a daughter wants to learn the preserving work. She's a hard worker." And then, because he was a proud man, and this cost him something real, he said, "We're short on stores. This winter's been—" And he did not finish the sentence. She finished it for him. "Come in spring," she said. "I'll show her what I know. Bring Orrin Jr. too if he wants work. I'll need help with the trees." He looked at her then, and what was in his face was not gratitude exactly. It was more complicated than that, the expression of a man updating his understanding of the world at some cost to his previous self. He nodded and went down the boardwalk steps. Stephen was at her side almost immediately. He had been watching. "You could have charged him," Stephen said. He did not mean for his daughter's labor. He meant the stores. She had 14 jars still in the cellar. She had told Stephen this in confidence, and she could have asked any price for them in February of that winter and gotten it. "I know I could have," Marin said. So the price I want from Orrin Galt is for his daughter to learn the work, and his son to come in spring, and for him to tell 4 people what happened up on that ridge." She looked down Birch Street at the February gray of it. "That's worth more than what I'd get for the jars." Stephen was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was deciding whether a thing was wise or merely young. Then he said, "I told you something when I first saw those trees. Do you remember?" She remembered. She remembered the gray limbs with the green tip, the trees that were still trying. "You said a dead tree doesn't try," she said. "Yes? And what were you when you came to that ridge?" She looked at him. The wind off the street was cold and tasted of coming snow. "Still trying," she said. He smiled then. "This," he said, "is not the end of what this land will do. You understand that. The trees are just now finding what they are. You are just now finding what you are. Give it the years, give it the water, cut back what is taking and not giving, and do not sell." He looked up at the gray sky with the practiced weather eye of a man who had spent 35 years learning what the Harlan sky was saying before it said it clearly. "You will not sell." She did not sell. By the following fall fair, the waitlist at Fisk's Mercantile had grown to 41 names. Bertie Potts was back for her second season, no longer earning in jars but in actual wages, and she was now faster at the work than Marin by a measurable margin, which Marin considered a personal triumph in the matter of teaching. Orrin Galt's daughter, a solid, methodical girl of 16 named Clara, had come in spring as promised and shown such patience with the trees and such intuition with the recipe that Marin had given her a key to the outbuilding she had built that April, a lean-to extended into a proper workshed with a second cook stove. Orrin Jr. had come too, as promised, and the stumps in the lower 20 were cleared by June, and the ground turned for the first time in 7 years, had come in spring as promised, and shown such patience with the trees and such intuition with the recipe that Marin had given her a key to the outbuilding she had built that April, a lean-to extended into a proper workshed with a second cook stove. Orrin Jr. had come too, as promised, and the stumps in the lower 20 were cleared by June, and the ground turned for the first time in 7 years. The trees on the south slope were in their 4th year of proper management, and they did what trees do when you have been patient with them through the years of trying. They opened fully. 60 trees bearing at near capacity, the fruit dark and heavy and split-resistant now, her own Caldwell variety, as Fisk's regulars had taken to calling them, dark-skinned plums that held their flesh even in the August heat, a genetic patience bred into them through whatever old country stock they had come from, and intensified through her 2 years of cutting and water, and the particular mineral conversation between their roots and the clay hardpan of the western ridge. She processed 320 jars that fall. She sent 60 to Mrs. Hendricks in Calder City, who had standing orders from both hotels and from a restaurant on the main street that had added Caldwell preserves to the menu description of its morning service by name, which Marin learned about from a letter, and which she read 3 times. She sold 80 through Fisk's at 50 cents a jar, which was fair for what they were by then, and everyone who bought them agreed it was. She gave 12 jars to Stephen, who by then was in his 73rd year and had begun to move more slowly, and he put them in his own cellar with the care he gave to things of real value. She gave 6 jars to the Harlan Ladies Charitable Association for the winter food stores they kept for the county's hardest cases, and she gave 4 to Orrin Galt's family. The remaining 162 jars she held for the fall fair. The Harlan County Fall Fair ran for 3 days in the 2nd week of October, and by the time Marin arrived with her wagon on the first morning, there was already a line at the spot where her table would be. She recognized most of the faces. She set up the table herself, arranged the jars in their rows, the glass of them glowing amber red in the October morning light, the color of something between a coal and a lamp, and she set a card in front that read 45 cents per jar, a price she had settled on after a long evening of arithmetic that took into account what was fair, what the market would hold, what Bertie and Clara had earned in wages, what the outbuilding had cost, and what she intended to put aside toward the land note the next 5 years. The arithmetic came out to 45. The 162 jars were gone by mid-morning of the 2nd day. There is a thing that happens in a community when it has been wrong about something for long enough, and when the evidence of how wrong it was is sitting in front of them in glass jars with handwritten labels, not just the evidence of one good season, but of 3 years of patient building, the root and the slope and the water and the recipe and the labor and the teaching. The thing that happens is not exactly an apology. It is more like a shift in the way people stand, a small physical adjustment, an unconscious acknowledgement that the ground has changed under their feet. Marin saw it in the way people handled the jars before they bought them, turning them in the light. She saw it in the way the men who had spoken against her in her first year now sent their wives or came themselves and made their purchase without comment, or sometimes with a brief word about the weather or the fair, which was their version of acknowledgement. She did not require more. She had never required anything from them but to be let alone to work. On the 3rd day of the fair, when the table was empty except for the card and a single jar she had set aside for Stephen, a young woman of perhaps 16 stood at the edge of the table for a long time and finally said to Marin, with the directness of a person who has been practicing the question, "How did you learn to do it?" Marin looked at her. She was thin and bright-eyed, in a coat that had been mended at the sleeves, the daughter of a farm family from the northern end of the county, Marin thought, though she did not know her name. "I started wrong," Marin said. "I had bad fruit and not enough money and trees everyone said were finished. So I started there and I paid attention to what the bad things were willing to do." The girl looked at the empty table. "But how did you know it would work?" Marin was quiet for a moment, thinking of gray trees with green tips, of a clay field cracking like a dry hand, of the long winter arithmetic done by lamplight, of Stefan's patient voice telling her the difference between a thing that was dead and a thing that was still trying. "I didn't," she said. "I just knew it hadn't stopped trying. Neither had I." The girl thought about this with a seriousness that Marin liked. Then she nodded once, the way a person nods when they are storing something for later, and went away down the fair ground. The last jar went to Stefan that evening. She drove it out to his farm in the early dark, the October air carrying the first edge of the season's cold, and he opened it at his kitchen table and spread it on bread, and ate it with the meditative attention he gave to things he respected. The lamp threw their shadows long on the wall. 320 jars, he said. 320, she confirmed, next year. 400, if the lower 20 does what I think. He looked at her across the table with the look of a man who has watched a thing he believed in become exactly what he believed it would be. It is a look that contains its own particular kind of happiness, the happiness of patience vindicated, which is among the most durable of satisfactions. "The tree is not dead," he said. He was not talking about the tree. Outside, the wind moved through the ridge, and the orchard answered it, 60 trees in the late dark, their leaves going amber and gold in the season's turn, their roots deep and certain in the clay that everyone had said would yield nothing, the ground that had been cut back and watered and asked properly, and had given back everything that had been put into it, and then, quietly, patiently, abundantly more.